And we are now live.
So this is Senate Appropriations Committee, and we're continuing our work on the budget adjustment bill, which is being voted out of the House this week. And so we're taking testimony on the Center for Crime Victim Services, who are experiencing a shortfall in revenues and are here as part of a budget request. And I don't know who's going to do the lead on the testimony. Jennifer, is that going to be you or Carol, as it relates to the budget request and, the reasons that one is necessary?
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. If it pleases the committee, I was going to start with an overview, and Carol Brochu is our resident expert when it comes to the details of the numbers. And if that would be an appropriate use of the committee's time, that's how we'd like to proceed.
That's fine. And of course, 3 members of this committee are also members of Senate Judiciary. So you're going to see familiar faces as well today. So yes, why don't you start then, Jennifer?
Well, good afternoon, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Senators. And I'm Jennifer Pullman, for the record, the relatively new Executive Director for the Vermont Center for Crime Victim Services. And I'm here with Carol Brochu, our Director of Finance and Administration as well. And we'd like to thank the committee for taking time to hear our budget adjustment request. As you see, there was language in H679 that House Appropriations did approve our request, and we're grateful to House Appropriations and to the House Judiciary Committee that submitted a unanimous letter in support of our request. Would it be helpful, Madam Chair? I know that I have 3 friendly faces that I see quite a bit of the center. Would it be helpful for me to spend 2 minutes in terms of an overview?
Well, we have
on the center specifically, or would you just like me to jump in?
I think actually the committee is pretty well versed. Senator Westman is a former appropriations chair and has a long time. And I think Senator Starr was here when we've done the budgets for the center routinely. So I think we probably have some context for your request. And I know that we've had some discussion around, how these services are financed and, the policy around that. So I don't think it's necessary to go into much detail, but if it relates to, your proposal, or you think it would help us understand it, then that would be fine. Probably the best thing to do is to talk about the revenue sources that you rely on to support your work and why you're experiencing the shortfall.
Great, thank you very much. And I know that this issue was just taken up in this committee last year, and many of you who've been here for a while may recall that even back in 2013, there was a report to the legislature essentially identifying that relying upon special funds and federal funds was essentially creating an untenable situation. And unfortunately, due to several different reasons, we are in a worse situation than we ever could have predicted right now. Special funds themselves are down 47%, and there's a couple of different factors that we see that have contributed to that. Most recently, Vermont Digger had an article on January 9th wherein they identified that across the state, law enforcement has issued 40% less in terms of traffic tickets. And as you may recall, again, that's a large part of where we get our special fund dollars. And state police, which have been primarily the ones that we've relied upon, they're down 59%. So traffic tickets have long been going down, but especially during the pandemic, and also due to a change in police practices, that's a piece that has changed, and we don't see that that's going to be a robust source at any point, perhaps ever again. As you all know, with COVID, prosecutions are down, so fees and fines are not being even ordered, never mind collected. And unfortunately, we had thought that perhaps we'd see a bounce back with the openings of the courts, and we have not seen that at all. Our revenues are down even further than what we had seen in 2020. And I know that the courts have been dealing with the overload in a couple of different ways, one of which is just large amount of dismissals that are happening to clear the docket. Many of you may be familiar with the situation in Franklin County where 400 cases were dismissed to make space in terms of the court docket. So that has an impact on victims and has an impact on our revenue sources. And then in a very positive way, there have been policy changes that have looked at the way in which we want to put fees and fines on the backs of offenders who are trying to get off caseloads, who are trying to get a second chance, and whether or not those should just be waived altogether. So that, again, is a positive policy practice and reform from our perspective, but again, it has those ripple effects. At the federal level, again, we've seen over the past several years a decrease in the amount of around $9 million that could have been coming into the state, but due to changes in VOCA, due to the way in which that fund has been capitalized, has gone down dramatically, impacting programs throughout the country. And there's been a VOCA fix most recently that it promises to provide some sort of support moving forward. We've seen about a 30% 30% increase, but that's a 30% increase from an all-time low in terms of maybe 15, Carol can speak to that, 15 or 20 years in terms of what we would be drawing down from VOCA. So we're at that place where we had the red flags back in 2013. You all had spent some time talking about this specifically, and the red flag's been waived, but we are here saying, like, there's nothing else we can do at this point. We're looking at cuts, despite the most prudent of budget building on Carol's part. We are at the place where we are looking at direct cuts to direct services without an adjustment made to our budget. And I also just do want to note that with COVID, not only are what we're seeing is not only an increase in the types of cases that are especially interpersonal violence, child abuse, domestic violence, and sexual assault, but an increase in terms of the severity of the violence in those cases. So cases are coming in that are more complex in terms of the needs victims have, but also are presenting with much more serious challenges in terms of the violence experienced. And again, Carol can speak more to what she does in terms of trying to build a budget every single year that's based on a completely unpredictable landscape. We are the most weirdly situated agency as this quasi-state agency that basically has to build an entire budget on projections and predictions. And there's no real way to go about, or to continue to go about doing that when we're talking about core services. And I did provide a memo, and I'll spend just a minute walking through some of the requests. And I know, again, Carol is here and Daniel Dickerson from JFO. But essentially, we are in need of upwards of $1.6 million to fund shortfall that, again, could not have been predicted. And we did our best to try and avoid. The Victims' Compensation Program has a current shortfall that we're looking at of about $1.3 million, maybe a little bit less. I know Daniel's been working with Carol on that. But again, that's supporting victims' compensation claims, supervised visitation programs, domestic violence coordinator position that provides training throughout the state. The victim assistance program that provides funding for 27 different advocates within the state's attorney's offices. And then frankly, just keeps our doors open. We are down 9 full-time employees over the past couple of years, and we have no plans to try and figure out how to fund those. We are operating at bare bones, and we need to keep our doors open in order to continue to administer federal funds, special funds, and provide technical support for our programs in terms of their own grants. Pardon me, I'm recovering from COVID still.
I was going to say, I hope that isn't symptomatic.
No, it's taken me a lot longer than I thought to get rid of these residual effects, but could have been a lot worse. The Domestic and Sexual Violence Fund, as you see, that's also suffered a shortfall. It relies on those same special funds to get that fund in place, and also relies upon marriage license, and that's never been a really fruitful source for them, and not a lot of people were getting married in the past couple of years. But that provides really critical support for the actual programs themselves, for domestic and sexual violence trainer, and again for the DV council coordinator. And I think I want to underscore that the center doesn't take any, not even a cent from that special fund. It's a direct pass through. We provide the support for the programs and in terms of reporting and accountability. And then finally, a new request that you'll see was an unfortunate one, but the Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence has long operated for the past several years a legal assistance clinic for victims of domestic and sexual violence and child abuse. And those services are really critical. They are provided in the civil realm or as an adjunct to needs that might crop up with the criminal court process. Victims and survivors, especially now more than ever, are in need of support around custody, divorce cases, housing situations, wrongful termination, other pieces that really impact applying for benefits, other pieces that really impact their day-to-day welfare in a way that the criminal justice system just is not set up to do. And especially when cases are not even being processed through the criminal justice process, this piece is really, really critical. They've provided support in over 800 cases. Just in 2021 alone, over 420 victims were provided with support. Again, that's free services or low bonus services. And they were even able to reach out to 53 individuals considered homeless. So the work that this program does to provide a more holistic response in terms of supporting victims of crime and outside of the criminal justice system is absolutely critical. That grant was ended briefly. We are seeking just bridge funds on their part just to keep those doors open. Without the bridge funds for that, the network doesn't have an ability to cover the cost to keep those doors open, and the clinic is in danger of closing pretty much immediately. And I believe that this committee is in receipt of a letter from Sarah Robinson from the network that speaks to some of the details about that particular program.
Could you just talk a bit about the 112? You said that it's a contract, that you contract for those legal services?
Traditionally, the network has held the grant themselves, and they have contracts. They have attorneys on staff, but they have contracts also in the community so that they can provide localized support for individuals, and that simply is just by way of referral. And there's an assessment done, and then the attorneys are working with victims and survivors in whatever capacity is needed. Another example is when victims are, their medical records or mental health records are being subpoenaed. These are individuals who are able to protect their privacy rights. So that's some of the different ways that they can provide assistance.
Okay, thank you. We do have your memo, and I know that the House in the budget adjustment has included the full amount of your request. Here, 1.55 million to the center, and then the 112 to provide the legal services to victims. So the bill as it's coming to us does include the request in full as the recommended. So we haven't gotten that bill yet, but we will very shortly. So I just want to let the committee know that this is this was proposed and it will be included in the bill as it comes over to us. Other questions? I know, Senator Sears, this is an area very much of interest to you relative, well, certainly how we fund the services and the significant, I mean, 1.6 million obviously is not a small amount of money to make up, but the work that you do is certainly so important, and the world around has been so unpredictable. It's really had a tremendous impact, I'm sure, not only on your budget, but also on your staff, on the staff that are supported. So, Senator Sears.
There's no question the pandemic has had a huge impact, but I look forward to working with new leadership of Jen and the Center for Crime Victim Services. It's no secret there was conflict between some members of the legislature and the prior director that created some problems. But the fact remains that the funding source using fees from marriage licenses, traffic tickets, etc., is not sustainable. And as we're looking at a time when flush money, it may be a good, and I realize there are many things in the governor's budget, from tax cuts to other things, that will affect the long-term budget. They're not, they're not just one-time expenditures.
Mhm.
I think this should go on as one of the priorities, is how to refund the Center for Crime Victim Services, the Network Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, and other victim services. They're absolutely required services, and I don't think we can go on in the present system any longer without expecting this every year to come back. So, I recognize that, the governor doesn't want, us to spend the new money on things other than one time, and I agree with that. But you look at the tax cuts, you look at other things that are more than one time that will affect the long term. I think this is what has to get up there as one of the priorities.
So I think what you're saying long-term, or when we're considering the 23 budget, we really should be looking at whether these services should be funded through the general fund mechanism on a predictable basis.
Yeah, I would prefer to see the fines go, not to have to rely so much on the fines and the fees.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because even when we start back up, there's been problems, as noted, since 2013, at least, if not before that. Carol probably can give us a long history.
Well, a lot of us were around in 2013. I don't know, Senator Baruth, were you here in 2013? You were. So I guess we all were then.
I think so.
But I obviously this raises the larger question about how this program of these services are funded, and at what point you acknowledge that you kind of pushed it as far as you can, and now is the time to move to a different funding mechanism. And probably this would be under judiciary's jurisdiction, Senator Sears?
Usually is, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But in terms of the fines and stuff, that all came from finance.
Yeah. So
the fees.
Let me ask, obviously fees could be still paid, and help offset, but the predicted, obviously the ability of the general fund to absorb it is quite different. The total appropriation is how much, Jennifer or Carol? I'm just wondering, the 1.6 is against how much of your total budget here?
Good afternoon. For the record, Carol Brochu, Director of Finance, Center for Crime Victim Services. If you're talking about the compensation fund, which is the 1.3 essentially, and as Jen mentioned, Daniel's on here, so it may be less than that, but currently the 22 appropriation is $2,306,772. What we're seeing is that, what's been mentioned over and over is that the revenues, even though when building the 22 budget, I decreased our appropriation knowing that our revenues had decreased, I certainly couldn't predict that 22 would still see effects that we saw in 20 and 21. Mm-hmm. Recently, just getting the legislative fees, it was interesting to see that the difference between 20 and 21, that they actually went down, and now we're continually seeing that in 22. So we, anticipate at least being $1 million short at the very least on that appropriation. we're only at like 900,000 right now on a $2 million appropriation. So, without a doubt, the revenues are not going to be able to sustain the amount of grants. And as Jen mentioned, all of the services that are provided with the compensation fund.
Okay. Well, I guess we're going to have a bit more discussion on this. But in the meantime, we've got to get through this fiscal year, and in terms of the demand for, well, I don't know, it's hard to say. The network, we're seeing more stress. We're seeing more mental health needs. We're seeing more substance abuse. I'm just wondering, in terms of outside the, say, the court system, are the agencies around the state experiencing a higher demand for services? Are you seeing more families coming in, or victims of domestic violence coming in for services in terms of money is down, but actually the demand is greater than ever?
Absolutely. I appreciate the question. What we're seeing is the advocates are being asked to do more with less, and also asking them to be more creative in terms of how to deliver services and provide them when traditional avenues that used to be open are not. I believe the network experienced an increase of about 15,000 calls to their hotline, if I'm recalling correctly, last year. And absolutely, what I sit on the Victim Services Advisory Board, the Vermont Citizens Advisory Board to DCF, and the cases that are coming in, again, are similar to what we're seeing that the network is, that they're more complex, the level of violence is more significant, and trying to get families back on their feet is more challenging than ever. And the reverberations that have throughout all the systems, including the criminal justice system, is significant.
That's what I expected your response to be.
Now, as you identified, those issues of substance abuse, isolation, unemployment, just all the other pieces that we know are those risk factors that are out there, they are having the expected impact.
Okay. Other questions about the request? Senator Sears, you have anything more you want to add, or if you're muted?
I think we've gone through this. I don't know where to begin, really, other than taking their revenue. Maybe Dan Dickinson can help us to look at the revenue shortfall from fines and fees over the last few years, and knowing that this one is particularly difficult. There are fewer traffic stops, particularly last year because of the pandemic, I think. Well, people were driving less, number one. Number two, I think police were somewhat reluctant to pull over drivers who might have been might have been pulled over in the past, but now with COVID and everything, they were reluctant, unless it was egregious. So but it would be, if we could look back the last few years, what is the shortfall in their budget, and how can we, are there other places to fill it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let me just ask, looking forward to 23, do you know what the governor has in his budget in terms of, are you actually positioned to be exactly in the same spot again? Because this conversation, it's not time limited. It's going to be a continuing challenge. My question is, to what extent the governor's proposed budget begins to make some progress or recognizing this revenue decline?
I guess I can answer that a little. I think we're going to be having the same conversation, except the numbers are greater, because not only as Jen mentioned, one of our largest grants, federal grants that we received we've seen about a $9 million decrease in the last few years, that grant that we rely so heavily on has decreased. And what we're seeing naturally is that the grant that we have in the 23 budget is $1.5 million less than this year's grant.
But I'm talking about something totally different, I think, in the federal. We're all, every program subject to federal budget cuts or increases.
Yeah.
I'm talking about lost revenue from the fines and fees that are associated with the victims. I don't know that we will want to get into the business of covering every loss of federal grant throughout state government.
No, we can't
I
do
think
that.
I don't, we can do that. And we made that, I think we made that clear over the years. I'm talking about the loss of funding from the fees and other monies that were supposed to come in that might be made up either through general fund or some other way. I know there's been I go to Senator Leahy's office and they tell us that, you've had an increase, and you tell us we've had a decrease, and I can't make heads and tails out of all that. And we get into quite a battle a year and a half ago or 2 years. Yeah. But so I'm not sure whether, whether the increase, decreases in federal funds, we can work those things out. This is a structural defect that is into the center's funding. So that's what I'm going to solve.
Well, let me ask, the positions that are in the state's attorney's offices, the victims advocates, are they funded fully? Are they, historically, they've been funded by the grant?
So that is a good question. And that is our reliance on that federal grant that I speak of, is that the victim advocate program has been supported primarily with VOCA funds and our state special funds, that compensation fund. Okay. So we rely heavily on both to support that program. And that program, as you all may be aware, continually the expense grows year after year. And we rely on funding streams, both federal and state, to support a program that are decreasing year after year. And again, this has been historical. So we are at that point where if you don't have the federal funds, you don't have the special funds, the cost keeps going up. We certainly are going to see this in the 23 and going forward until another funding source in order to maintain these programs. Remember, we haven't increased our programs. We've built a level budget. We've decreased our operational. We've decreased our personnel. We're just trying to maintain the grants that are already out to all of these service providers and trying to do that with less and less. So that is our greatest challenge.
Okay. Well, I think we'll have to just pull this apart, and Dan at Joint Fiscal can help us in terms of the different streams of funding and what those trends have been, and what and how those revenues have been, how they're being utilized. And so I think there's obviously more work ahead of us, and maybe this is the year to really start dealing with some of the things that have been sort of postponed, because this is not a new discussion. Obviously, it's just about 2 decades old at this point, and you reach a tipping point, really, where you have to make some changes or make decisions about what policy decisions around what should be done and how it can be done, and the resources available to support it. So I think we'll be working closely with our colleagues in judiciary to figure out what is a good path ahead, as opposed to simply punting it down the road for another year.
Thank you.
Senator Nitka.
I'm just wondering, are there positions, victims advocates positions that are not filled right now? And if so, are you recruiting for them if there are?
I believe there's only about 1 or maybe 2 that are, and We don't do the recruiting, that comes from the state's attorney's offices, but we've made our commitment to this program, as we have for the past 35 years that we've been funding it, that we're not going to enforce a vacancy savings. One of the vacancies is in Chittenden County, and that county can ill afford to go without their advocate position that's needed. So again, it's one, maybe two, but again, we've affirmed our commitment to this program in that, especially now with some of the changes and the reforms and what life looks like for victims, that those services are really important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Well, yeah, Jane.
Yes, it's Senator Starr.
Yeah, the only thing, I don't know if we got an answer to your question. Did the governor increase your budget for 23?
No, I think the answer was no. It's just level.
Our
It
general
does
fund
not.
is-
It does not recognize the loss of these revenues. So the response was, no, it hasn't been addressed, and we're going to be in the same spot next fiscal year, only worse. If I could just restate what I believe Carol told us.
That is correct, and the general fund is level funded for our appropriation.
Yeah.
And I'd also
If I-
like to, I know Senator Sears mentioned the federal funds. I just want to clarify with that because I said I would answer that as well. The center, you may have heard, has received 2 federal grants, VISPA ARPA funds. And although, this is one of those things where we did receive federal funds, but these federal funds are specific for COVID relief, and they're not to be used for already, the existing programs that we're talking about. Frankly, this money hasn't even been awarded. It has to go through the application process. But again, it's very specific to those needs.
What I would still like, and if Dan can get it, or working with Carol can get it, is the loss of revenue as a result of the fines and fees. One question, then any loss of federal funds is a second question. I feel more determined to try to make up within the general fund or some other place the loss of through fees and others. Obviously, 2020 was an unusual year in that all kinds of things happened that changed behaviors, and traffic tickets, etc., marriages, you name it. So I would rather look back to maybe a 5-year period so that we can look at the steady downward trend of the reliance on those fees and fines.
A historical trend line.
Yeah.
Okay. And recognizing you're going to have a real blip here once COVID hit,
Right.
but it should help get some sense of what you're telling over the years collectively, what's been the impact. And also, Carol, you made reference to the number of positions that have been reduced in order to manage to the money. So it's kind of helpful to have that as well, because that obviously has an impact on the services and the functioning of the program. So that we'll look forward to that, and that'll be more in the context of our 23 budget deliberations. In the meantime,
I would plan to hold, a week of hearings on the 20 in the Senate Judiciary on the details of the various budgets, but also, as Carol just mentioned, the use of the ARPA funds. I don't remember if we put anything into the center, but I do remember putting more money into the network programs through ARPA.
I thought she was referring to some special grant applications, but that haven't yet been determined, but maybe I misunderstood her on that.
Yeah, it's not the state ARPA funds. This was from the HHS directly to the center. There were 2 grants. I believe they're close to 1.6 million or so that are directly to the center for that. Each one has its own specific things that are needed, and they go for about 4 years. But again, it's not anything that we can use, unfortunately, to meet the deficit that we have in the current grants that we're issuing And as far as the revenue, Senator Sears, I've been doing this for quite a while, as you mentioned. I can go back 12 years, I believe, and I have those numbers for you where I can.
Okay,
show
well,
you.
if you can work with Dan
I
and
will. I
put
will.
him
certainly
into
do
a
that.
way that even I, who wasn't ever good at math in college, can understand.
I think we can do that.
All right, thank you.
That's
I'm
why
just
they
looking
put
at,
me on appropriations, so I was never good at math.
but you can make tough decisions, Senator Sears, and
Yeah,
sometimes that's
that's-
equally as important.
Right, right.
Okay, I'm going to then, we have a lot more work here, but in terms of the budget adjustment, I think we have the information we need. And I'm just looking at my other clock. It's a little after 2 and Commissioner Harrington is in the waiting room. So unless there are further questions for Jen or Carol, we'll move on to the Department of Labor. Okay, thank you very much. Obviously, we'll have more conversation.
All right, thank you very much for your time, senators. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so now we have Commissioner Harrington. Are you here all by yourself or do you have some staff?
We do have
Oh,
staff,
there's Chad. I see Chad now.
and Cameron Wood, our Director of Unemployment, is with us as well.
Oh, good.
Oh, all right. So we are taking up your budget adjustment request. And I don't know, are you doing the presentation, Commissioner, or with comments from your staff, or are you gonna, however you want to do it is fine with us.
Great. So for the record, Michael Harrington, Commissioner, Department of Labor. It's okay with the committee. I'll kick us off and then let Chad and Cameron fill in the blanks. I think we provided you all with the presentation we gave House Appropriations back on January 5th. Happy to share my screen if that would be helpful, or I can just walk through it. What would you prefer?
I guess you can put the screen up.
Okay.
Some people have 2 devices, but I think Alice finds one of them is her phone, which is a little small.
So this may be helpful then. What we did was put together a presentation for House Appropriations, and I'll just walk through this here. One second.
Whoops.
Yeah, it just froze here, so I need to. Sorry, computer issues.
Commissioner Harrington, would you like me to share the screen and you can sort of prompt me through the pages?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah, we've heard that the Department of Labor has computer problems.
Yeah, well, they manifest themselves all over the place. Thank you.
I think that's false news, Senator Sears.
Uh, So we'll just go slide by slide. So the first thing you see on your screen is just a breakdown of the department. It just shows the various programs that are under the department and the different sub-programs that are under each one of those. We don't need to go through this in detail. It sometimes helps for people to see the full picture in terms of the areas within the department, which include workforce development, unemployment insurance, labor market and economic information, our workers' compensation and safety division. We have a legal services unit and then a business services unit. And there are a couple different boards and commissions that come out of the department as well. We can go to the next slide. This was just the House Appropriations just asked us to put in what we had originally submitted for our ups and downs, if you will, our budget information for FY22 originally. So you'll see here that under unemployment insurance, there were no specific ups. There was some down in the federal funding category. And that was mainly, I think, lost due to just different programs that had been covered in the prior year. And then you can go to the next slide. In our specific budget, we provide, as many of you know, a supplemental sheet by program. So because the department is 85% federally funded, UI has been traditionally 100% federally funded, except for penalty and interest money that has helped cover the gap. But you'll see here for the FY 22, we had some unemployment insurance administration dollars. We had, again, at this point, it was just a projection when we put this money forth, because the federal program year starts in October and runs through September. So it's a little off cycle, makes it a little hard to compare apples to apples, but we were projecting about 9 to 9.8 million. That didn't end up being the case. We ended up with 7.9 million. And then there was additional funding, 3.3 million that we received in other funding, other Fed funding that was given to the state. So CARES Act and others. Next slide. So this one, you may just want to zoom out, Chrissy, just a
Yeah.
little.
Yeah. You don't
So
even have Francis Perkins listed there.
Yeah, so the unemployment insurance program, as many of you are probably familiar, started with the Social Security Act of 1935. All 53 states and territories have laws or provisions for their respective UI programs. The objective of unemployment is to provide partial wage replacement. There's, I think, a debate about whether it should be partial or full, but on premise, it's partial wage replacement to those who become unemployed through no fault of their own. So they don't quit and they're not discharged for some type of cause or misconduct. Eligible individuals must be able and available to work. So there's a lot of conversation about this, especially during the pandemic, but the premise behind unemployment is that you have to be not only able and available, but you have to be looking for work as well. And, you know, so if someone is out of work because of a health related reason, they're technically not able and available and would not be eligible for unemployment. Claimants must certify every week. So it's not a one and done and you get a certain number of weeks. You have to certify every week that you're unemployed. And the claimant's benefit amount is calculated based on their prior earnings. All employer tax contributions are deposited into the UI trust fund to pay benefits. So no contributions from employers go to administering the program. They all go to benefits, and employees do not contribute to the UI program. So again, there's some misconceptions out there, but employees aren't directly contributing out of their paychecks to the UI program. An employer's tax rate is calculated using their total payroll amount, prior claims on their account, but then they are also ranked against all the other 24,000 employers in the system. So that's what makes it hard when an employer says, well, how come you can't tell me how to calculate my rate? And part of that is because we never know where an employer is going to rank against other employers. So we can do the first part, that's not hard, but to know where all 24,000 employers rank, to know which bracket an employer ends up in, that is done once a year in the spring, and it sets the rate that begins each July.
Yeah, Commissioner, could I ask a question?
Absolutely.
I'm wondering, I've had a couple of calls with employees that have callback times set up, and do they still have to recruit work every week?
So if they have a return to work date, so a callback time, as long as it's within the 10 weeks, they do not. They have to identify on their initial application that they have a return to work date. We do ask employers to confirm return to work dates. We do have, for instance, we've had employers that maybe not through any fault of their own, but have thought they were going to call people back and then need to continue to have them out of work. So there are some specific changes that may occur over time, but if they're qualified with a return to work date, then they don't need to search for work.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, sir. And then just the final two on this page. In 2020, the Vermont UI program had been predominantly federally funded, which I mentioned, except for some penalty and interest money. And then employers receive a federal tax credit called a FUTA tax credit as long as the state program remains in good standing. So when we talk about the importance of adhering to federal laws and making sure we're running the program in accordance with federal regulations, the value there is that employers receive a tax credit. Next slide, please. So this was what we.
All right, this is really what I've been trying to, that other slide made me feel like I had a migraine with that arrow and it was off kilter. So this is your budget request is, total budget request is 12.8.
Yes. So the total funding for so there was no general fund funding appropriated in the base FY22 budget. And part of that was by design because we didn't know if federal programs would be renewed. We also knew that there was additional federal funding likely to come, both to the state and to the Department of Labor. And like I said, our federal program doesn't actually begin until October 1. So we also needed to wait and see how much money was appropriated to us. So you'll see that a rough articulation of this comes to about $26,203,996 to run the program for the FY22 year. When you subtract out the federal funding we're receiving, which is 7.9 million roughly, and we have some additional CRF money of about 5.5 million, it brings our budget adjustment request to 12.8 million.
And what did the House do?
At this point, I don't believe they've made a decision. And Chad, correct me if I'm wrong, but.
No, they provided 12.8 and 5.5 for a total of 18.3 to address the shortfall.
Yeah, the change they made was just in the source of funding for the 12.8 from general fund to ARPA state fiscal relief dollars.
Yeah. Okay. So the money is there. It's just how it's funded. Okay.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Senator Bruce.
I'm just wondering if we could get a little articulation about the call center services. I know that was a big item, especially when the initial crunch hit, but how has that played out and where are we now, if you would?
And is that still with Maximus? Is that contract?
It is. And if we move forward a slide, maybe 2 slides, it'll just.
Well, let's just look at the numbers and then we'll go on to that discussion. It's hard to imagine that the federal support of this program after so many years is so it has declined at a time when the need and the pressure has never been greater. And I don't know whether if that's going to be the view in the future, Commissioner, or whether there's going to be some effort to provide better federal support consistent with past history, or whether we are actually going to be seeing a need for state funding for this UI, the administration of this program. I don't know, that gets into the 23 budget. Are you anticipating, you were talking about this year, how this year's budget was built that's led to this $12.8 million request. And I realize I'm jumping ahead, but for 23, are you seeing anything that's going to be different in terms of the federal support for the administration? And if not, does the 23 budget that as the governor's proposed, address any of this?
So a couple different questions there, but in my honest opinion, and this is talking with Cameron and others, I don't think we expect any federal funding to increase over the near future within the next 1 to 2 years. So our federal funding has been roughly level funded, give or take $500,000 here or there over the years. It usually comes in kind of 3 different forms. One is base funding, then we occasionally will get above base funding, and then which is kind of based on an adjustment of volume. And then we get supplemental budget opportunities, so special funding. Our base funding has fluctuated somewhere between 6.5 and 7.5 over the pandemic. I think this year we're at 7.9. So again, a smaller increase of a couple $100,000. The prior year, we had received some above base funding. This year, we have not received any above base funding as of yet. In pre-pandemic years, it took us about 10.5 million to run the program. We received typically 6.5 to 7 million from the federal government, and then we supplemented the other 3 to 3.5 million with either penalty and interest money, or as we were running our prior modernization efforts, we were able to build some staff time for the modernization effort. So the cost of UI has only increased, and it will not necessarily decrease to pre-pandemic levels. It will certainly decrease from pandemic levels, but it won't go back to where it was in 2019 in terms of cost to run the program. And I don't see the federal government supporting UI programs completely. And every state is I think in this position.
And so that it's a good segue to the 23 budget proposal. Does it address this funding situation at all?
It does. So there's a couple different pieces in there. There's some base funding increase. There's some additional funding for modernization, not just the technology, but the business side of modernization. So the department's needs during modernization. So it does address it. It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, if we ended up coming back in a future budget adjustment with some additional needs, but part of that too is, again, wanting to always be mindful of where the federal allocation is going to be at, which we don't usually know till mid to late September, and sometimes even after the start of the program year.
Okay. Well, then let's go on to Senator Baruth's question about the call center.
Yes, ma'am. So to your question, Senator, we stood up this call center in record time. We have gone out to bid for these services since then. Maximus is our current provider of service. At the height of the pandemic, we went from like 8 call center representatives to 315 call center representatives. We're now back down, I think, below 50, and that will probably continue to taper off over the course of the rest of this fiscal year. We also are using some contracted services to help with our adjudications fact finding. And there's some nuance there, but essentially they help just bolster the effort to decrease the backlog and the time it takes to hear a case. So again, we're not back to a place where I think we can operate and cover the call volume with 8 to 10 call center representatives. We may get there eventually. I think one of the conversations or debates that we'll have to have is that prior to the pandemic, when the program was running its own call center, it was underfunded. We were down. We had kept about 20 to 25 positions off payroll for vacancy savings to help manage our budget. So we went into the pandemic with a program that was designed to have probably 75 staff in it, and they had about 50 staff in it, 55 staff in it. So we were under supported going into the pandemic. We also, during our busy season, or even not, we're seeing high volumes and high wait times at our call centers on specific days and specific periods. So, there was a strong desire by both the administration and the legislature to make sure call volume was managed and people didn't have to wait a long time. But I think we're going to have to make that decision about what is an appropriate wait time, and then do we staff to that level? And it may mean that we need to have more than 8 or 10 call center representatives answering the phones on a daily basis. So right now, like I said, we're down to about, we're under 50. I think the last I checked, we were at 50 a couple weeks ago, and we had plans to taper that down as well. The contract goes through the end of this fiscal year, and then I think there's an opportunity to renew for a year if we decide. too.
Okay,
Well,
other
thank you.
quest-
I appreciate that. I just wanted to quickly say, I know that you all took a lot of heat in the moment, but I will say that the handful of times that I had cases with constituents that were stuck in the system, I contacted you or your department, and you were very fast, very efficient, very helpful. So I appreciate it.
Great, thank you. And appreciate the help from everybody. It was a team effort for sure.
Are there other slides, or we could then pull up everybody's?
There are
Basic.
other slides if you want to see them. I can just so you know what's in there. This gives a line by line breakdown of what was on the previous slide. So that just, if you want to read through it on your own, you can do that. But it talks about each line and what each line represents. On the next slide, this just looks at FY21. So you get an idea of the prior year. We ended up with receiving about 53.5 million. We spent 47.6. There's some funds remaining, but they're federal funds that are allocated for specific purposes. So they can't be used for general administration. They have to be used for things like fraud mitigation and prevention and some others. So just so you are aware of that. But that gives you an idea of kind of the in and out cost and expenditures for FY21. On the next slide, this just talks about our fiscal accountability. So there are a significant number of financial standards. You see those on the left that we have to adhere to. And in the past 12 months, I think we've done about 8 to 10 audits of various size and scale and various topics. But certainly the program has been reviewed and re-reviewed multiple times over the past 12 months. And is under regular monitoring for fiscal accountability. On the next slide, this was just what I was going to show, and I don't need to go through it line by line, but it kind of gives a pre, a during, and a post, and post being 21. So it's a little different than where we are now in January of 22, but you can see where there was one program. Then there were 9 programs that we were administering. There's still those 9 programs, even though we aren't necessarily accepting applications for all of them, they're still being administered. And that will go on for some time for program integrity purposes. But you can see the difference in staffing between pre-pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, and then post-pandemic. And at the bottom, you'll see kind of the fiscal the funding aspect from the federal allocation. So in green, that includes some modernization money. It includes some additional federal funds. And then you see they actually decreased our funding in the height of the pandemic from 6.7 million down to 6.6. And the additional base funding was smaller as well. And then this year, they increased us from 6.6 to 7.9. But again, when you're talking about, and this is for every state, when you're talking about programs that are costing, in some cases, 3 to 5 times more than what they were originally designed to cost, the additional, $1.3 million really is just a drop in the bucket.
Well, maybe because of all the ARPA money coming, or the CRF money, they felt that in fact those federal dollars could and should be used to support this workload.
And that is quite possible. And some states have chosen to invest those in various ways, everything from program administration to modernization to shoring up their trust funds. And luckily, Vermont was in a very good place with the size of its trust fund, and we didn't end up having to borrow like some other states did. Next slide. I think the last couple of slides, this one just shows a snapshot of a week in time. So the week of December 25th, there were roughly about 3,700 people filing for benefits. So again, you'll say, well, this is way, and by the way, that is now up to about 55 to 5,700 right now. Again, part of that is seasonal and just but it's still below our annual average for seasonal period. So in the winter, it's our busy season, and we have somewhere between 5.5 and probably closer to 6,000 claimants collecting benefits during a traditional winter season. So we're still slightly below where we are. But that also, because of the warm weather, because of pent up demand, it took a while, and some of the employers ran longer this year than they typically do. But you may say, like, well, why aren't your costs going back? Part of that is because we've got additional technology, we've got additional programs we're administering. Like I said, we're still doing cleanup in all these programs, federal monitoring in all these programs, auditing, program integrity. A significant amount of claims work is still occurring, even though we aren't accepting necessarily new applications. And then the last two slides, there's one on adjudications numbers and one on appeals. The very high level snapshot is that for the most part, adjudications are actually back to where they were pre-pandemic and are slightly below where they were pre-pandemic in terms of the time it takes for the case to adjudicate a claim. And I should just say that, the claims get adjudicated for all reasons. It's not always a sign of wrongdoing. Sometimes it just means there's more information that needs to be gathered. Or, for instance, if someone claims that they received severance pay, then we need to validate that severance pay with the employer. So it goes into adjudication so we can validate that amount and do some fact finding. It doesn't mean that there's any belief that someone is being deceptive in any way. But the next slide, I think, and where I just want to highlight is that appeals is our sticky point right now. We have a lot of cases in appeals. It's taking us a long time to get through that backlog, mainly because we have been staffing up for the past year and a half. It's hard to find staff to fill those positions. There's frequent turnover, but we've gone from 3 administrative law judges. I think we're up to 12 now, but there is constant turnover, and so you're rehiring and retraining, and that has been the most challenging pace. So, I would say 9 times out of 10, when you're hearing from your constituents about issues they're having with their claims, it's likely because they're going through either an adjudicated issue or an appeals issue that is slowing their claim down. So our goal right now, and I, as you know, or likely know, there's negotiations and discussions and a pending lawsuit with legal aid on this aspect, but we've got a variety of different things that we're working with them on to try to figure out how to shorten the time lapse on our appeals. But it's actually pretty average or pretty commonplace right now across the country in terms of states with significant appeals backlogs, because it kind of all, as it goes through the system, it all flows to appeals. And that is just a very time consuming effort.
Okay.
And that is
So
it.
current appeals, 810 are pending.
Yeah, I think there's probably less than that now. Again, this was presented a few weeks ago, and it had numbers from a week or two prior to that. I would say we're roughly somewhere around the 90-day mark, give or take, in most appeals. So, last I heard, we were hearing appeals, we were scheduling into February, and the appeals we were going to be hearing in February were from November and December of 21. So we're about three months out at this point. And I think we're actually into December now, but in our scheduling. So again, that's better than it was. It was 6 months or more, but we've been able to retain some of the staff in that area. Part of that is because they're temp staff, they're limited service staff. They're not super high paying jobs. They don't come with longevity. So that has been a challenge. But they also, you do need individuals that have some skill and ability to understand both federal and state regulations and apply those regulations to each claim that they're hearing, and it comes with due process rights for both the claimant and in some cases the employer. So they each have to get afforded the opportunity to participate. There's sworn testimony, there is evidence gathering, and depending on how these come out, they also can be appealed both to the Employment Security Board as well as the Supreme Court. So there is an amount of legal rigor that has to come with it as well.
Okay. That's the last of the slides? Okay.
That is, so happy to answer any questions.
Committee questions? You've been a system under siege for quite a while. I'm sure people are feeling a little worn at this point. And we're still getting some calls, obviously, in terms of cases.
I do think, and you'll see, and I don't think it's a surprise, there's going to be funding requested for modernization. It's not the silver bullet, but it would help from everything from how claimants interact with us, our ability to meet their needs or at least communicate with them better. And it would also help with things like adjudications and appeals, because right now, a lot of those efforts are manual. So you literally are hand gathering evidence and information and literally typing out determinations for each case you hear. And so when you can automate some of that into a comprehensive technological system, it does help quicken the pace for sure. And it looks like Senator Westman may have a question.
Well, that was you just hit the question that I was going to ask, because I think moving forward, it would be way more efficient once you get a new IT system. And I think it's probably in terms of next year's budget that you'll want to talk about that, but I think we'll want to hear about what's going on with that.
Absolutely. And there is, I think even tomorrow will be before House Information and Technology. So happy to come back to this committee to talk modernization. Just an interesting part. I mean, one of the basic functions that comes with most systems now is some level of intelligent adjudication. So if you answer a question a certain way on the application, if more information is required based on how you answered that question, it then may prompt the system to ask you 3 more questions to get more information, and then that way the system can actually adjudicate your claim without a person actually having to do anything. And so right now, if you answer a question a specific way, like I received vacation pay as a payout at my time of separation, it just goes to adjudications. And now someone needs to call you, conduct an interview, contact the employer, and it just draws it out. So the more that we can put into some level of automation, the better off we'll be, but the better off Vermonters will be as well.
Well, and what we'd be better off financially if the department is more efficiently run because of the new IT system. So in that respect, I would think this committee would be interested in that.
We're obviously interested because there's going to be a request for the modernization, and we've already done Dan Smith had done sort of a review for us of the proposal, and I'm sure that the commissioner or staff have been briefing the Technology Oversight Committee as well in terms of the project. I guess it also shows that multi-state initiatives are very hard to succeed. Years ago, this was done with cash out, and EBT for food stamps with 3 states, but it's really difficult, and it oftentimes falls apart because you have to get consensus and one state won't agree. And so you spent a lot of time and effort and money pursuing that. It sounded good conceptually, but the track record of being able to pull it off is not very great.
Sounds like you may have lived through that once or twice, Madam Chair.
I've lived through a lot of things. So I right now, this is all focused on UI, and so we'll be having more discussion when you come in with your 23 budget. I don't know if some of the governor's initiatives about, the Workforce Investment Board and recommendation, is that something that is being advanced out of the Department of Labor, or is that ACCD?
There's a couple right now. So the one that's coming from the administration is coming from us. I know that there are other legislators that also have proposals as well. So we may be able to dovetail them all together.
Well, we'll see how that all, but that's for 23.
Yeah.
So this is to get you through this current fiscal year. Other questions? I know Chrissy just sent me a note earlier saying you had a hard stop at 3, so I want to give you a little bit of a break. Unless there are further questions. You obviously made the first hurdle, which is one where they have, spend a lot of time on the intricacy, the details of the request, and that's the house. And so your request is included here. I don't think anyone is going to deny that you've been a department under, the workload and the stress and the problems have been pretty it's unprecedented. I hate to say that term, but as far as you're concerned, I'm sure you've gone through a very difficult time and people have hung in there, difficult at best. So thank you. And I'm looking, I see no more hands. So I guess we'll let you get back and have a few minutes before your next appointment or whatever you're scheduled to do. So thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the committee. Always, we enjoy coming before this committee and we appreciate the continued support. So thank you very much.
Oh, you enjoy coming before the.
This is one of our favorite committees, so.
Well, we have a lot of institutional knowledge here.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the time. If you have other questions or need us to come back, just let us know.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Chrissy, we're moving on, and our next witnesses, are they here yet?
They're not here yet. We bumped them from 3:15 to 3, and I've already reached out to Brenda to see if she can hop on now.
Okay.
So I'm just waiting to hear her respond. So we're hoping we can just get her in the room quickly, and then you guys can carry on.
Okay.
Do you want to take a 5-minute break, or do you want to?
Why don't we do that? Why don't we take a 10-minute break?
10 minutes?
And then come back at 2:55, and that way that we can wrap up because we've got training tonight. Is that at 5? Is our
5 to 6, isn't it?
5 to 6?
What training?
It's the CSG
Okay.
training module.
Constituent engagement training.
Oh.
So we're still online, or can we